A friend of mine's actually reading The Body Keeps the Score right now, and she's had some really good questions that I thought I would start to address. So she's reading through it second time now, and she's saying, "Hey, I'm really interested in like the neuroscience part of it, right? How trauma affects the brain." I'll be the first to say it is incredibly complicated, to say the least, right? Even what we know now, I'll be the first to say this here. We are in the infancy stage of what we know about trauma, how it affects the brain, and all that. I consider myself somewhat of an expert on the topic of trauma as it relates to neuroscience, all that. But comparatively, if you look at someone like Dr. Andrew Huberman, I pale in comparison, right? But comparison is a thief of joy. So I know there are others who make Andrew Huberman look infantile in his vast knowledge of neuroscience, neuroanatomy, and how trauma affects the brain, and so on and so forth. So really, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we know what we know based on the information that we have available to us. So that to be said, we give a brief breakdown, subsequently lead into other videos about how trauma affects the brain. So this is a drawing that I pulled from the internet because, trust me, you don't want me to draw this out. No one will understand it. Not because it'll be overly complicated, but because my drawing is absolutely awful. All right, so right here we have the frontal lobe, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the brainstem slash cerebellum. Yeah, Bubba. I got my son there in the background. So take a look. Those are the major parts implicated in trauma as it relates to the brain. So what's happening when you experience something traumatic, right? And let's be clear, trauma is about how you're responding to the event, right? Trauma is what happens afterwards. You might experience something that I could objectively feel is traumatic, right? Maybe you get shot at. And I say, oh man, that must have been a traumatic experience. But then you say to me, oh no, it happens all the time, or it's part of the job. Maybe you're in the military, law enforcement, whatever, and you don't see that as a traumatic event because either comparatively something happened that was more traumatic, right? Or it's just something that happens so frequently you no longer have a related stimuli to it that promotes or identifies it as trauma. So again, trauma is not necessarily about what happened to you. It's about the response to the thing that happened to you. In the same way that I could stub my toe and say, oh man, that was a traumatic experience. You might say, well, Maddie, that's not a traumatic experience. You just stubbed your toe. But hey, maybe it is for me, right? Maybe there are certain things associated with that create a traumatic experience for me. So just keep that in mind. So what's happening here? Well, essentially what we start off with is the amygdala, right? That part right there, right? Experiences a stimuli. So let's take something that we could say objectively is traumatic for, 8 out of 10 dentists, right? The amygdala is the fear center of the brain. So a car accident, right? A car accident occurs and the individual goes, oh man, the amygdala goes off and says, hey, this is a scary experience. Maybe my car rolled a few times. Maybe there was some injuries involved in that. So the amygdala shoots off and says, okay, we're going to associate this with a fear stimuli, right? The next time we get in the car, we're going to remember the car accident. Even if it's been days, weeks, months, years after the event, there's that association that's occurring in the amygdala, right? The hippocampus is then going to process that as a traumatic memory. Now, the hippocampus is the area of the brain that's going to store and encode those memories. And so the longer that we have this memory sort of encoded in our brain with a specific stimuli response, especially that emotional response encoded in the amygdala, the more that it's going to play a role in how we respond in other areas or other related areas. Excuse me. Now, the brainstem and the cerebellum, what do those come into play? Well, those regulate heart rate, breathing, so on and so forth. So when you find yourself maybe having a panic attack in relation to this thing or something related to it, perhaps it's been a year since the event and we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of it. It's what we call a trauma-versary. Around that same week, month, even around that same sort of couple months leading up to it, you might experience some increased heart rate, more than usual, panic. You could see some implications in your workout, right? Maybe your gas tank is not functioning as well as it normally does. Well, what's happening is your brainstem and your cerebellum are going back to the day that happened, right? The dysregulation that occurs in trauma will find itself back there during those trauma-versaries primarily, if not dealt with. Now, there obviously this is going to look different for individuals who have healed, and not all experiences are similar, so we'll go into much more detail about that later on. Finally, this frontal lobe right here, this rational brain right here, that's going to shut down during traumatic experience. So that rational part of your brain that says, hey, we're okay, we got this, everything's good, like there are other situations, that shuts down during trauma. So when you say to yourself, why can't I just get over this? Why do I know logically that this thing can't hurt me anymore? This thing is 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 months ago, 5 months ago, whatever the case may be. It's because in that moment, your prefrontal cortex shut down. You have not encoded a memory to allow you to feel otherwise, which is why it is so important to go back to the trauma, right? We need to go back to the trauma, process it, and reevaluate and bring new memories to the forefront. EMDR is a fantastic way to do this, going through therapy. But I'll tell you what, at the end of the day, the number one thing that I cannot stand that a lot of clinicians will do is tell you, oh, you have PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. You're stuck in that. Just be kind to yourself. You experience something traumatic and it's going to be a part of who you are. No, it does not have to be, right? I can't take away the fact that something happened. However, I can take away the emotion that you have associated with it. I can say objectively, yes, that car accident was scary. You rolled a few times. You got a TBI, traumatic brain injury, maybe broke your arm, and you were bleeding out, and you didn't know if you would make it. Yeah, hey, you know what? Those things are horrifying. But one thing I can do is reprocess that memory with you, allow you to be like, yeah, that thing happened. But now my focus, the thing I'm going to encode is that I'm alive. And from that, I got to learn what I want to do moving forward, right? And hey, you know what? Maybe it wasn't your fault. Maybe you're just driving along and someone else is an asshole and they cut you off, or God forbid you come face to face with a drunk driver who decides that, that extra drink was more important than other people's safety, and you were the byproduct of their poor choice. However, you couldn't do anything about that, but what you can do moving forward is decide, I'm not going to let their lack of proper decision making affect my life moving forward. I'm going to do these things that are hard. I'm going to look at that trauma and say it no longer controls me, right? It is me versus me at that point. In that moment, I was facing a battle with someone else. I was facing a battle with my car, with my health, with my regulatory system, with everything else. However, moving forward, it is now me versus me. That is the toughest part of the battle. There are 2 points in trauma, 2 major points. The first point, which is, I will go on record as saying this is my opinion. This may not be shared by others, but this is what I truly believe. The first point, which is the most difficult point of trauma, which is the least difficult point of trauma, is when the trauma happens. That's the least difficult part of trauma because that's momentary, right? That may be a day, a couple hours, minutes, whatever, even a couple weeks. It's the thing that happens afterwards. That's the hardest part. That's the second point. That is the thing that is most difficult in trauma. Hear that again. The second part, the thing that happens afterwards, the moments after the occurrence, are far harder. And that is what people struggle with. They do not struggle with necessarily with what happened, right? To some extent they do, of course. But the struggling comes afterwards. Now, here's the good news. Here's the cool part. People always say, man, Maddie, it's been a week since I last saw you. I couldn't wait for our next session, our next therapy session, because I look forward to this healing every week. Allow me to flip the script on that for a moment. The healing is not what happens in the session. That is simply processing how you feel about it. The healing is what occurs in between the sessions, right? My role in your life is very minimal. Believe it or not, my role in your life is simply to allow you access to the healing, but the healing then occurs outside of the session. Because what happens, in between those things, what happens in between point A and point B, it's that you decide, I am going to unlock my potential or I'm going to remain stagnant. And listen, I'll be here for you either way, but I will not lie to you and tell you that stagnation allows for growth. No, growth comes when you decide, I am going to change, I am going to implicate the way that things are and turn them into healing, turn them into growth, turn them into opportunity. Every single one of my clients that heal, that grow, that do the hard things, They are the ones who are doing the work outside of session. They are the ones who are reading the books, reading the articles. They're the ones who are going for runs. They're the ones who are saying, I'm going to face that thing even though it's really hard. I'm going to follow through even though it's really hard. That is how you heal, not in the room. It's what happens afterwards, right? Take the first step, come into the office, let's talk, let's break it down, and then allow the healing to occur the rest of the week. Then you come back. Let's game plan again. Let's break it down. Let's see what we want to work on next. And then the healing occurs over the next 6.5 days. All right, guys. Talk to you soon.